Hello everyone, welcome to Bonnie Makes Cards. The cards that I'm featuring today may not look like they have anything in common, but they do. They are all made with Simon Says Stamps wafer dies. But instead of creating die cuts, I have created stencils. The first card is summer themed, using Simon Says Stamps picture book critters, the crab, fish, and turtle. I begin by making a stencil just using ordinary copy paper. The downside of using copy paper is that you only can use the stencil once. But the positive is that you end up with a nice crisp edge on your stenciled image. I also incorporated a Simon Says Stamp leaf die that I thought looked like seaweed. It had partial cuts, so I had to finish trimming off the leaves. With my stencil complete, I'm ready to work on my background. A layer of tumbled glass sets the stage for a watery background. My favorite thing stencil, Drifts and Hills, is perfect for creating some waves. I use a combination of salty ocean and tumbled glass. When one wave is complete, I turn my stencil before beginning another wave. In this way, I avoid a uniform look and I end up with a more random, natural appearance. I splatter some water on my panel to create a bubbly, textured appearance. I started off with a larger brush to create big bubbles and then moved to a smaller one to create small ones. I sprayed my stencil inside a splatter box with Pixie spray, which is a low-tack adhesive. When the stencil is placed over the panel, I make sure that I rub well to get good contact. Post-it notes mask off areas that I do not want ink to be applied to. All of the leaves, or seaweed, was ink blended first using a combination of twisted citron and squeezed lemonade. Candied apple and abandoned coral were used on the crabs. You could choose to use just one color, but the additional color just adds a little bit more depth to the image. The fish were inked with ripe persimmon and carved pumpkin. For added interest, I put a stripe on each of the fish. I used MFT's stencil that I used to create the background. I used the darker of the two inks, ripe persimmon. The lone turtle was inked with twisted citron, and then some shadow areas were applied using forest moss. When the stencil was removed from the panel, I used my craft pick to help lift up those smaller areas of paper. For the die cut sentiment, I wanted to incorporate a fun stacked element. Using the word summer from Simon Says Stamps for season, this word was cut 3 times from each of the 3 colors used. I chose a teal, a soft blue, and white. The die cuts were sprayed with Pixie spray and then stacked together. I found once I had the first 2 stacked, the rest went on very easily. And the result is this fun detail where you can actually see the stripes of colors. The panel was attached to an A2 size card base. I placed the die cut sentiment on my panel so that I could position the secondary sentiment. What Are You Up To was stamped with VersaFine ink. For detail, I added in a green line on the seaweed and some crystal Nuvo drops. For my next card, I wanted to use a die that I actually have never used. This bikini die was included in a Simon Says Stamps card kit that is older, and I actually don't think it's available anymore. But because we're looking at really how we can extend the use of our dies, any die that leaves a recognizable silhouette can be used. The rainbow ink blended background was created with wilted violet, chipped sapphire, peacock feathers, picked raspberry, abandoned coral, twisted citron, and squeezed lemonade. The bikinis were stenciled with Hero Arts unicorn white. A second stencil was created using chipboard so that I could apply Faber Castell's glass bead glitter gel to each of the bikinis. The card was finished up with a die-cut sentiment from Simon Says Stamp, Summertime, done in teal. The third card features Simon Says Stamp's outline clustered leaves. Instead of using the negative portion of the die cut as I did in the first two cards, the next three cards will use the positive die cut. This leafy branch was quite fine and a little bit finicky to get on my panel. An ink blended background was created with pine needles, peacock feathers, and tumbled glass. Using a craft pick while the ink was still wet on my panel helped me remove that stencil without leaving any marks. Before embossing the sentiment, the panel was die cut with a scalloped rectangular die. The sentiment, Family is Everything, is from Simon Says Stamps, Thanks and Leaves. The sentiment was embossed twice, giving it a nice puffy appearance. The secondary sentiment was stamped with black VersaFine ink. The panel was attached to white sheet foam before being adhered to a card base made from 110-pound Nina Solar White cardstock. A little bit of double-sided tape holds the card closed so that I would have a flat surface to work on as I attach my embellishments. Pale blue confetti was scattered amongst the leaves and around the sentiment. I like to use Nuvo Smooth Precision Glue to attach anything that is small. A small droplet of glue is left on the panel when the pen is depressed on it. I finished up with Nuvo Crystal Drops Morning Dew on each confetti. The drops dry clear, leaving a nice shiny blue embellishment. The die-cut stencil for this card is Simon Says Stamp's Sunflower Stem. Because I wanted the sunflower to have some color, I started off by applying some squeezed lemonade and some twisted citron where the stencil would be applied. I did have to wait for the ink to completely dry before the stencil would adhere to the panel. For the blended background, I used abandoned coral, bundled sage, and a little bit of twisted citron. After removing the stencil, in bits and pieces I might add, I'm not sure why it was hard to remove for this card, I was ready to do my sentiment. The sentiment from Simon Says Stamps, Thanks and Leaves was embossed using a gorgeous color called Golden Sunflower by Nuvo. Before stamping the sentiment, I did die cut this panel using Simon Says Stamps frames. I used the scalloped frame die. Sheet foam was attached to this panel and then adhered to an A2 size card base. A small amount of glue was used on this frame before it was placed around the panel on the card base. A little bit of double-sided tape helped my card to lay flat so that I could embellish it. I chose a pretty sequin mix of coral, pale yellow, and grass green. The addition of the clear drying Morning Dew Nuvo drops made these sequins really pop off the card. This final card was made in exactly the same way as the two previous cards, so I won't go into as much detail. The stencil was created with Simon Says Stamps Cottage stems. For the ink blended background, I used antique linen, old paper, weathered wood, and faded jeans. Some additional interest was added to the panel by debossing it using Altenew's dotted scales. For this card, I used a die-cut sentiment from Simon Says Stamp called Hello Crafty Friend. The shadow for the scripty words was die cut from both sheet foam and cardstock that was inked with weathered wood. The scripty words were die cut from white cardstock. The panel was adhered to an A2 size card base, and then the sentiment was attached to the card. This card was finished up with a few white Nuvo drops. That wraps up today's video. It is fun to look at our supplies and think of new ways that we can use them. Creating stencils is easy and another use for our dies. Thank you so much for your visit.